You know, work, study, making art, exercise, eating healthily, keeping in touch with people, bits of life admin, so on and so on. Mostly they're small things, but accumulatively they add up to a rather hectic whole. In contrast, the lockdown has allowed me to form a calm, holistic routine, free of many of the usual distractions, and thus for me, it's been a time of creativity and growth. The increased time means that I have means that I can enjoy everything that much more. I can appreciate the humble things that I love to do properly, and with a greater level of focus and attention. Also, as a side note, I think it's worth pointing out that I don't have any children, I don't have a partner, I've got a nice place to live in, and I've been furloughed on 100% pay, so that makes things a lot easier and alleviates some of the challenges that other people have had to face. I think I'm lucky in that I have a creative focus that gives me meaning while my life is restricted. Jana Vacha often mentions the existentialist psychologist and Auschwitz survivor, Joseph Frankl, in his talks, whose belief was that meaning can help us to endure even the most extreme hardship. Or as Nietzsche puts it, he who has a why to live can bear almost any how. I certainly believe that having passions, projects, causes, etc. gives meaning to our lives, which allows us to endure and even prosper through challenging times. Many people in my life have really struggled during this time because the things that give them their meaning are attached to their job or going to the pub or playing a sport, things that are dependent on certain conditions and other people. I suppose that I'm fortunate in that the thing that gives me my meaning has, if anything, been encouraged by the conditions of lockdown. While I'm pretty dedicated to my studies in normal times, I do normally have to juggle developing my illustration practice with a multiplicity of other things, which can be challenging. In contrast, during the lockdown, I've been able to dive all that much deeper into my artwork, which has been amazing and has allowed me to develop my craft and understand who I am as an artist in a really profound way. At the moment, I'm working on a children's book for my master's project, which is about diurnal and nocturnal creatures of the Scottish Highlands. It's a kind of love poem to the land I grew up in, a land whose beauty has astounded me throughout my life. The medium through which I'm realising my book is lino cut, so most of my days are spent mucking around with bits of lino and learning the different kinds of effects that can be made with various tools, mark making, and so on. I'm just going to show you some of my lino cuts. Let's see. Can you see that? Yeah, good. All right. Sorry, I'm in the wrong bit. Here we go. I'm not there yet, but having all this time allows me to enjoy exploring a new process while steadily moving towards the creative resolution necessary to complete my master's. I'm learning a lot, and there is something about the process of carving lino that I find timeless. I mean, linoleum itself hasn't existed for all that long, but carving is something humans have been doing in one form or another for thousands of years. And when I'm cozy in my room with the smell of linseed oil emanating from the cut lino, I get lost in a kind of creative trance. In those moments, it feels like everything else slips away and it's just me and the lino and my imagination. Images slowly emerging in front of me as I carve in ways both planned and unforeseen. Here we go. Another great lockdown revelation for me has been my daily walks. One of the greatest luxuries of the lockdown has provided is extra time. And with this extra time, I've been able to plan in at least 2 hours walking most days and sometimes more. Oftentimes I just wander out the front door and see where the wind takes me. In doing so, I've discovered lots of lovely nooks around the city. A babbling brook, an old chalk pit, a soft meadow full of nodding grasses and wildflowers, and numerous other magical spots. But other times I jump in my car and drive to areas of natural beauty outside of the city. But whether I'm wandering in the city or exploring new places in the countryside, I always enjoy connecting with nature, feeling the elements on my skin, and taking in all the sights and sounds around me. Some days I listen to music or a podcast as I walk, or I talk to a friend on the phone. but increasingly, I try to turn everything off and take in my surroundings, feel my body as it moves and breathe. I don't know if it's a result of the lack of air and noise pollution, or if it's just because I'm noticing things more keenly. Now I'm more calm and present. But when I walk around these days, the colours feel more saturated, the sounds crisper, the sensations more palpable. Everything is amplified. I feel a strong sense of gratitude for the small beauties that can be found all around us when we take the time to look. But the lockdown hasn't been all artistic creativity and mindful peace. During the lockdown, I have largely disengaged from the news and world events, and while it's done me a lot of good to disengage, I do feel a tension over this. On the one hand, it definitely makes me calmer and happier not to bombard myself with negative events that are largely out of my control. But on the other, I wonder if to ignore these events is a self-indulgence and a neglection of my responsibilities as somebody who's relatively privileged in this society. In discussions I've had at Sangha night and on the courses I've attended at Buddhist Centre, people are often trying to reduce their news intake. And while I agree it's a good step towards greater mindfulness, I also worry on some level we're indulging in a form of willful ignorance. The murder of George Floyd and the grief and rage that followed was definitely something I could not ignore, and it became a bit of an obsession for a while. Due to an important relationship in my past, race and racism and their effect on society are concepts I've grappled with and tried earnestly to understand over many years. In this instance, having extra time led to me disappearing down a rabbit hole, binging on books, articles, podcasts, documentaries about racial issues. And while I think being conscious about these things is super important, it got to the point in which I just felt a kind of impotent rage that I didn't really know what to do with. In the end, I've managed to step back a bit and take a breath. Subudra Mati's book, Not About Being Good, really helped in a way that I don't think I have time to discuss right now. But suffice to say, I've accepted that racism is not going to be something that ends today, and certainly not by my feeling upset and angry. But rather than ignoring my rage, I've redirected its energy in a number of small, but I hope meaningful actions. Things like making others in my community aware of the systemic nature of racism, and challenging those I know who qualify racism or choose to look the other way. I also want to make some prints based on some of the things that have come out of conversations I've had, or things that I've heard and read. I feel like this is a positive contribution that is creative both in the Buddhist and in the more common understanding of the word. There is so much more that I would like to say on this issue and about my lockdown experience, but I've used up my time now. I hope I've communicated the creative fertility that past few months have brought about in me. I feel as though the Dharma and my deepening practice have led to fruitful engagement with a number of things that are close to my heart. And in doing this, I feel I have grown in important and meaningful ways. Thanks for listening.
Many thanks, Chris, for that. That was great. That was like a little sort of window into your life over the last the various aspects of it. Yeah, thank you very, very much for taking the time to share that with us. Yeah, and we're gonna need to move on now. So now Samudra Ghosha is going to introduce our next speaker, Jacqui.
Hello, everybody, again. So just give me a city. So Jacqui has been a Mitra for coming up to 5 years now, and she's been in the ordination process for the last 2 years. You may have come across Jacqui in particular on reception. So this is going back to when we actually could go into our Buddhist Centre, and on a fairly regular basis, you'd find Jacqui sitting there on reception. And she's also been a stalwart member of the Wednesday lunchtime team, both offline and online. She's a very helpful, reliable, and also a very generous person. And Jacqui's someone with a good level of self-awareness. She's really interested in she wants to know the nature of things is, and she understands that means looking at her experience, and she's very open about yeah, failings, the things that she's working with, and so on. There's a real courage in that, and I know that yeah, well, giving a talk like this takes courage as well. And I'm really delighted that she's put herself forward to, or agreed to do this, and yeah, I'm looking forward to hearing what she has to say.
Thank you very much, Samudra Ghosha. And that was a really good start, because I forgot to unmute myself. That would have been a rather tedious talk, I think. Yeah, I'm a little bit nervous because I haven't ever done this before. And just to say that I have got some notes to the side of me. So if you see me glancing sideways, it's not because anything untoward is happening. It's just I'm checking my notes. So when I first started thinking about this talk, when Viryajyoti first asked if I would do it, it became clear to me that it was actually fairly easy to describe my experience in lockdown before I got to the bit about practice. I think because the lockdown period has been such a defined time, and I'm sure it won't have passed you by that it's exactly 3 months today. So March the 23rd onwards. So we've got this very sort of discrete, defined period of time. And for me, it was like a bit like looking back at a landscape that I'd been traveling through. So there was, there were early on, there were really, for me, there were really kind of joyful and balanced and settled bits of time. And then other things kicked in, a bit of boredom and a bit of anxiety, and that unnerving feeling when the rug's pulled out from under your feet, as everything that I'd planned just kept falling away and continues to fall away. And that's quite a challenge for me because I'm a bit of a planner. But I have to say that, a bit like Chris, I've been very fortunate. I've been well. I live with my partner and we get on well. We have a garden where I'm retired. I don't have to worry about work. I don't have small children at home. So, the conditions for me have been very good. And if there had to be a lockdown, this is probably the very best time in my life for it to happen, actually. At the same time as that, I've been aware of the background of what's going on, outside of here, and people's extreme suffering and loss. But I have to confess that mostly that hasn't impinged on me very much. And I think, again, a bit like Chris was saying, sometimes that's felt really strange and quite uncomfortable, actually, although it has changed a bit over the period of the lockdown. So what's this landscape thrown up in terms of practice? The very first thing I had to do was think about what I think practice is. And I don't know if this happens to you, but I find often somebody says something to me, or I read something which rings a big bell, and then it's coming at me from everywhere. Everything I listen to, everything I read is saying the same thing. And what that was at the beginning really of this period was turn towards your experience, Jacqui, whatever that experience is. My formal practice, if you like, my meditation practice and talking to people in the Sangha and coming to Sangha night, those kind of things, that actually didn't change very much with the lockdown. But off the cushion, sort of away from that formality, there was much more space and time. Again, like Chris was saying, I just felt so much more spacious, and that invited me to pay a bit more attention to what was going on. There's just been more space for that, and it's included all sorts of things. We've had the most beautiful spring, just the most beautiful spring turning into summer, and being able to see that and to watch that, this kind of slower pace, has been a real delight and a real joy. But it's also that turning towards has been about my reactions to things and my feelings about things. So really trying to notice what it is I want to turn my back on, some pleasant experience that I really want to get back to. There was one week early on in the lockdown, I think it was probably in April, when I had a sewing project going on, and I really enjoy sewing, and the sun was shining, and it was absolutely joyful. I just loved it, and I felt, you know, everything was very vivid and I was very sort of in love with my life, which was a delight. And of course that began to ebb away, as these things do. And I so wanted that back, you know, and again, it was just about trying to watch what was happening there. There's an American teacher and writer, I'm sure many of you will know, called Larry Rosenberg, and he puts it like this: our practice constantly reminds us that everything is worthy of attention. Living wholeheartedly involves being fully present in whatever your life is at a particular moment. Our practice constantly reminds us that everything is worthy of attention. Living wholeheartedly involves being fully present in whatever your life is at a particular moment. And that was, I mean, that was easy for me when I was in my lovely sewing sunshiny bubble, but became much more of a challenge as things outside really did begin to hit home. The Black Lives protests, the reality of what other people were going through the virus, and just, you know, my realizing that I really didn't have any control. I kind of knew that, but this brought it home to me in a new way, and that was difficult, and therefore really difficult to turn towards. And in the later weeks of lockdown, sort of more lately, I've had periods of feeling quite low and quite out of sorts, even though it seemed as though nothing particular had changed. I felt very different. And so, you know, now the challenge was to be fully present with those feelings of heaviness and sadness and lethargy and, you know, things I really don't want to turn towards at all. Fortunately, I had a conversation with a friend of mine when this was beginning to happen, and she wondered whether something quite subtle and quiet was demanding my attention in a different way, that was demanding something much more compassionate, much softer. And I had that thought went through my head of, oh no, I always forget about metta. And I don't always forget about metta, but I do quite often miss the cue for metta. And it was almost as though this sort of being aware and turning towards was, you know, it was a challenge and I was going to get to grips with it. And bringing metta in just really softened that and brought an open-heartedness and a kindness into it, which I really needed at that point. A couple of weeks ago, anybody who was here will remember that Samudra Ghosha brought us back to awareness and metta. And it does feel as though all roads, certainly for me at the moment, all roads lead there or lead from there. And the great thing about awareness and metta both is that they don't condemn me when I forget. By definition, they don't. They just allow things to be as they are. And in fact, I'm realizing how linked awareness and metta are, that they're kind of, you know, all mixed up the same thing, because as I bring awareness to something, it allows that thing just to be what it is, and it opens up space. And I had an example of this the other night when I couldn't sleep. I was awake in the early hours of the morning, and I thought, oh gosh, I'm doing this talk, I really ought to put this into practice. And it was 2 o'clock in the morning. And I don't know about you, but at 2 o'clock in the morning, my thoughts are really jumbled, everything's right in my face. and it didn't feel like there was any space for awareness or kindness, and I didn't really even know what kindness looked like at 2 o'clock in the morning. But I did stick with it, and as I just brought my awareness to how I was feeling with those jumbled thoughts and that sort of everything in my face, that what did that feel like? Actually, it did open up a space, and the feelings didn't go away, but I had the space to understand that that was just my experience at that moment in time, and I just needed to be with that in a kind way. And then, of course, I did eventually fall asleep. I'd just like to finish with something that I heard Mitra Devi say recently. Mitra Devi heads up the team at Taraloka, one of the women's retreat centres, and she's put a series of wonderful meditations and reflections online. You can find them on YouTube, all based around the natural world. They're short, the meditations are about 15 minutes, but they're really lovely. And she said this, and I found it very encouraging. She said, allow everything present to be fully felt, fully welcomed. And if you can do this for yourself, you can do it for the world. Thank you.
Many thanks, Jacqui. Really lovely talk there, really sort of close in to your working grounds and stuff. Yeah, very, very lovely to hear. 2 lovely talks. I can't say more because we need to hear another one, or we have the opportunity to hear another one. So Yashodhaka in just a minute is going to be introducing Claire, who is from Letchworth, with the Letchworth Sangha.
Hello everybody. It's my pleasure to introduce Claire Taylor-Jay, who you'll see in a minute. So I'm trying to do a 1-minute biography. That's a bit of a challenge, but anyway, we'll see how I get on. So Claire works as an academic at the Guildhall School of Music currently, but she's thinking of changing her career and having a sabbatical quite soon. And her involvement with the movement, she first met the movement in the 1990s, quite a long time ago in Southampton, then re-engaged with the movement with the Letchworth group, and I met her in this group about 6 or 7 years ago. And one Thursday, she started coming, and she never stopped coming from day one. And she said that it was like she had come home. Then a few years after that, she became a Mitra at the Cambridge Buddhist Centre a couple of years ago now, and saying a bit about her connection to the Dharma. Initially, she said she was really interested in the conceptual side of the Dharma, but in recent years, she's very strongly engaged at the emotional level with the Dharma, and this has really transformed her commitment to the Dharma. And this manifested recently in her taking on some responsibility for essential admin tasks with the Letchworth group, which she carries out very, very capably. So so I look very much forward to hearing what Claire has to say about her practice during the lockdown.
Okay, shall I start now? Okay, thanks Yashodhaka. Virya Jyoti had to twist my arm a bit to do this talk. I wasn't quite sure that I wanted to do it, first of all. And I think that's partly because I feel a bit ambivalent about the whole situation, about lockdown itself, and how I feel about lockdown. So on the one hand, I've quite enjoyed lockdown. You know, I'm an introvert, so it's an introvert's dream, being at home, not having to go out and socialise. As Yashodhaka just said, I've been unhappy with my job for a couple of years, and I'd already decided back before Christmas to take a year's unpaid leave from this summer, with the thought in the back of my mind that I might not go back. So at the end of March, suddenly it felt like my year's leave had started a bit early. Hooray, I don't have to go back. Even though I have been working, and I've been working from home, just mentally not having to go into the building and see my colleagues just felt like my year had started a bit early, my year off. And that was helped by the fact that about a week after lockdown started, I had booked some holiday anyway. So even though I couldn't go to Italy, as I was planning to do, I had a few nice weeks of being at home, having some nice weather, doing some gardening, having more time to meditate and to read. So it's all felt quite positive. And I've been able to kind of mentally disentangle myself from work for at least for a while. And like Jacqui and Chris were saying, I do realise I'm incredibly lucky. I have a nice house, I have a nice garden, I have enough money, I have a husband who I like to be around. So there's a bit of kind of background guilt for me that other people don't have it so easy in comparison. So that's one side of my lockdown experience. The other side is that I do have a strong tendency generally in life to get bored. So the days that I've been on holiday, the evenings, the weekends, I have had small fights with boredom some of the time. And I think the lockdown has exacerbated that some days. So it's given me something to work on in my practice to try and be with that. My background's in music, and there's a mid-20th century composer called John Cage, who you might know, who was a Zen Buddhist, and he probably had quite a big influence on me exploring Buddhism initially. He wrote books about music and his composition, and he also has little bits of Buddhism and aphorisms in his books as well. And one thing he says, which I remember frequently, is if something is boring for 2 minutes, try it for 4. If it's boring for 4 minutes, try it for 8. If it's boring for 8 minutes, try it for 16. Eventually you'll find it's not boring at all, but quite interesting. So that's something that I try to live up to, not always very successfully, but trying to feel boredom and not go and distract myself. And I do, particularly when I'm on retreats, I notice that I do have a craving for a simpler life. There is part of me that is kind of yearning for that, so I have to try and get better at putting that into practice. And one thing that was definitely noticeable in my practice during the 2 weeks holiday I had was how having less stimulation from work did make an impact on my practice. So I could spend more time in the garden, which is always a complete joy for me. I could meditate in the evening as well as the morning, which I had never done before. I could do more Dharma study, and that was all great. So I did get into a bit of a role at that point, and there was some momentum behind my practice, which felt really good. But as I've gone back to work after my holiday and having lots of Zoom meetings and things to do online with work, it has dissipated a bit again. But I will finish working in about 2 months, so I'm going to try and retrieve some of that feeling that I've had earlier in the lockdown, to get back to that a bit more and face up to the boredom. And another area of ambivalence for me is this whole question of how the virus for a lot of people has brought a bit of perspective on reality and on suffering and even on death. So I know from things that people have said here on Sangha Night and in other CBC events I've been to, that especially at first people found that quite challenging, that there was this realization that there's a virus that's out there and could be quite serious and could kill people. For me, it's all felt quite unreal because I haven't known anybody who's had it. None of my friends or family have had it. So again, I felt a bit of guilt from time to time that I've not felt enough metta towards the people who are suffering at the moment, and that I've just felt quite closed off from the world. And it's been interesting seeing how for a lot of people, particularly the non-Buddhists that I know, how they've faced that kind of big dose of reality. So a couple of examples. I have a friend who has been incredibly paranoid, even really very concerned, who wears gloves and masks all the time whenever she goes out of the house, who wipes down all her parcels with disinfectant, which feels a little bit like horrified anxiety to me, that she's very over the top in her reaction. On the other hand, there's my 75-year-old father-in-law who decided a few weeks into his lockdown, he's in Germany, so they were at a slightly different phase, but when their lockdown was still in place, that he wanted to see his grandchildren. So his grandchildren came round at a safe distance. And he said, you know, he could be dead in a few years anyway. So he wants to see the people he loves as much as possible while he still can, and not live a longer life, but a miserable life. So there's an interesting point there about quality of life versus quantity of life, I think. And also my 90-year-old neighbour, who has had one of her family members around pretty much every day, has gone off into town shopping most of the other days. So I suspect her feelings about the virus is similar to my father-in-law's. So for me as a Buddhist, I haven't really been affected by that big dose of reality. And I think the reason for that is because I experienced a big dose of reality last autumn when my husband was diagnosed with a brain tumour. And he's better now, and it was operable, and it's all fine. But it was an interesting few months. So I think while other people have had coronavirus to bring them up against the reality of the world and of our lives, I had that back in October, November last year. And in comparison, a virus which I might not get, and if I do, it might just be a bit of a cough, seems quite tame. And what was brought home to me at that point when he had his brain tumour was some real kind of Dharma realities coming home to me. So firstly, the realisation that he is going to die, and that, in relation to coronavirus, we are all going to die. I think we live in a culture which has quite an extreme fear of death, which maybe explains how some people have reacted to the situation. But, we're in quite an unusual time historically where most of us live long and fairly healthy lives. Most of history has not been like that. There has been much more disease and death around for most of human history. So I think if the Buddha was to kind of pop up this evening, he would remind us about the story of Kisagotami. We are all going to die, and we've got to get used to that idea. And it feels a bit controversial to say that. But another thing that the experience with my husband's tumour brought home to me vividly was the relationship between suffering and compassion. So I had at that time quite intense experiences of feeling more compassionate towards others, even though I was also suffering myself, and feeling their compassion for me. The German word for compassion is Mitleid, which literally means suffering with. And I got a feeling then of a close connection between suffering and compassion. So to bring that back to lockdown, I think we saw something of this particularly earlier on in the lockdown, of how it awakened people's compassion, and they got a feeling of the sense of suffering, and that led them into, having more sense of community, being more willing to volunteer. So that's my experience. It's, my experience of lockdown is very much coloured with what I experienced before lockdown. Yeah, I'll finish there.
Great, thank you very much, Claire. Some very, very sort of penetrating reflections there that you shared with us. Very, very interesting and thought-provoking. Yeah, so wonderful, isn't it? Just to have those, have our three speakers have sort of shared their experience and practice in this time when we've been in transition in terms of the conditions of our lives and the broader circumstances around us.